Hi everyone, I'm Komal Dalchat from USIP and you're tuned in to watch Insaaf ki Baat today. And we have with us Amber Shamsi, who's flown all the way from Karachi to join us for the podcast. Amber, thank you so much for joining us and welcome to Insaaf ki Baat. I don't think we need to tell our viewers what a great personality you are. You're an award-winning journalist, you're an IVLP fellow, you're currently leading the Center for Journalism, and you've just mentioned that you sort of survived a mob lynching to get to our podcast today.
Yes.
So thank you so much.
I had to walk over coals just to get here to this office.
We are grateful. All of us are extremely grateful. So, since such precarious situations prevail in your journey, I'm just going to immediately jump in and ask you, what's your take on the current situation of the country? We are in a crisis like never before. The IMF program is at a halt. We don't know what's going to happen. Loans and bailouts from the so-called friendly nations, we don't know what's going to happen with that either. And then we're unsure what is going to happen. Is this going to become a more sort of a judicial military democracy as we move forward? Or do you think this is sort of going to be the final push that sort of spurs us into a proper parliamentary democracy model? What's your take on how this is going to go?
So I think one of the things that you kind of experience as a journalist, which is there's a lot of deja vu. And in Pakistan, I feel that you keep getting that deja vu. You know, as I was driving to the office today, Supreme Court, all the DSNG cameras, media was there, lawyers are there with their placards. And it really took me back to my first big Supreme Court hearing as a journalist, which was Yusuf Raza Gilani, Prime Minister. He's disqualified within minutes for not submitting, to the orders of the Supreme Court. And I feel like it's constant deja vu because then it takes me back to the Panama case, it takes me back to other cases. You know, we have this saying in Pakistan, which is कि मुल्क नाजुक मोड़ पे है.
Yes.
मगर अब वो भी लफ्ज़ जो है बहुत कम लगने लगा है. क्या हम महा नाजुक मोड़ पे हैं, शदीद नाजुक मोड़ पे हैं? What's
It's a
happening?
never-ending nazuc mor.
It is never ending. Like I said, it's deja vu and you're constantly back there again. You know, it's hard to make predictions. I'm not one of those journalists who say, well, I know what's going to happen because this. I do think that this crisis could be an opportunity for a better transition. At the same time, we may have to go through a lot more mini crises before we get to that point. And my fear is that if we're looking at past patterns of history, the instinct is to control a little more and then before the dam bursts. So that's my fear, which is what you're indicating, which was a judicial military-led, I don't know if you could call it democracy. We used to call the Imran Khan, General Bajwa, General Faiz sort of triumvirate, a hybrid 1.0. We've had lots of arguments, analysts, my friends and I, journalist colleagues, well, is this hybrid 2.0? Is it hybrid 3.0? But I do think at the moment we are going through that similar hybrid regime. Does that mean controls are going to be tightened? In a crisis, that is a temptation of a state that prioritizes security, centralization, control. So I feel like there's going to be a few more crises before we can make, and this is when me being hopeful, where we come to some kind of transition. I don't see that happening yet because all of the players, there's a lot of high stakes involved and there's obviously no meeting point as such. And I feel that at the moment when you see, conflict within the Supreme Court, which is meant, or the highest court of the land, which is meant to be an arbiter of sorts, not of political, obviously, issues, which it should not absolutely be, but it has been, and that's why we're here. And that's because there's obviously a power tussle. You have, a split. I wouldn't even call it a split. Obviously, there are different points of view within the military establishment as well, and perhaps a cleansing post Bajwa's retirement. So there's obviously that. Political parties. We would say the Pakistan Tehreek Insaaf and the PDM plus Pakistan People's Party. They're all on one side, and they're clearly going for the kill, right? It is a Game of Thrones and somebody has to die. And I think Rana Sanola, the Interior Minister, said that as well. It's either us or them. We got a lot of flack for it. But I think that's been the case for the last 4 years, where when you saw that Imran Khan was in power as well, he may not have been as thuggish and is much more sophisticated, wouldn't say it. But I think his actions also demonstrated that he recognized that he needed to cut the opposition then down to size in order to retain power. It's the same with the current government as well. They need to cut Imran Khan down to size, potentially that what would go in favor for them is a disqualification. So what I'm trying to say is, I mean, there's a background to all of this, and I think it has roots in the establishment of hybrid 1.0, and you're seeing a breakdown. And in some cases, maybe a mental breakdown for the people, as well as many of the players involved serving or retired. And there are no solutions. However, I'm just going to end it again with a hopeful note that I'm hoping that this may lead to a transition, but I don't see it happening very soon.
Well, I hope that unlike Game of Thrones, this doesn't have 7 seasons. We sort of,
I hope we like the last season, because we didn't like the last season.
Right? So
I hope the last season is a good one.
Yes, and there is no
satisfactory ending.
And there are no mass murders, nothing of the sort. We sort of stay safe. So now that since you've mentioned the transition and how sort of like a post Bajwa cleanse, I also wanted to speak to you and ask you, what's the impact that you think this sort of hybrid regime or the military judicial complex has had in the last few years on journalism? We all know that there has been a crackdown. We know that there has been a lot more control from the center. Media has been sort of controlled. There's crackdown on all of the journalists. Freedom of speech has been sort of tarnished. There is no more. I would say that it's much more controlled freedom of speech, if there is some semblance of a freedom. But controlled speech is what we're sort of headed towards. How do you see that? And also, how do you see that transition, or is there a difference? I think difference would be the right word, between when Imran was in power and now when we sort of say the PDM is in power and perhaps this is like sort of, the true democracy is in power. Is there really a difference, or is journalism sort of still going through the same upheaval as the political parties go through their own upheaval? What's your take on that?
So I don't think journalism or the threats or attacks against journalism have actually changed since the PDM government came into power, which obviously tells you the same thing, where obviously when a political party is in opposition, it tries to find support within the legal fraternity, media community. And it does that by obviously using attacks against media as an opportunity to attack its political opponent, which is the political party in power. So I think the tactics used to control media have not changed. Right. I just think that the channels and the faces have changed. There has been, I think these attacks against journalists there's a wide range, which is physical attacks. We saw the death of Arshad Sharif tragically last year, which, I think that had a very chilling effect on journalists across the country. But we've also seen those attacks continue in many other ways. I think the legal instruments have also been the same: sedition cases, using the Pakistan Electronic Crimes Act against journalists. As an example, I think this is something that was really worrying as well, which is that there was a journalist from Mole who was picked up because he allegedly had a role in leaking certain information about General Asim Munir, I believe, to a independent news media that operates outside of the country. And this is kind of similar to what had happened when there was a story about another general.
We've seen it happen time and time.
Exactly, and that was used against, there was a particular ex-journalist who was also part of the Securities and Exchange Commission, who was, disappeared for a little while. So those tactics, I think, have really not changed, and that's a real tragedy here, where, for instance, this government had promised to review the Pakistan Electronic Crimes Act. I don't know where that review is happening.
This government or the PDI government?
This particular government that's in power right now, which is the PDM government.
Right.
Mariam Aurangzeb, the information minister, had promised that they would review it, revise it, look into it. That's going nowhere. We've seen PEMRA constantly use the same kind of tactics to censor, to shut down, stories, as well as topics that are of public interest, because it has a very short-sighted view of its role. So the Pakistan Electronic Media Regulatory Authority is not meant to control media, it's meant to facilitate the media. It's meant to, its focus should be on media organizations, not on the content.
Yes.
That's a problem. So I really don't think the tactics have changed, and that's a tragedy. What you've also seen, obviously, is when this hybrid model was being constructed, there was one of the sort of key, I think, highlights that came out of it was actually the split within the media. And I'm talking about 2014, where you saw when Imran Khan was leading his dharna.
Yes.
And you saw certain certain media organizations that were gung-ho, that were really enthusiastic about it. There was a lot of disinformation back then about how many people are died, how many people are being injured, a lot of panic, and other media groups that played it much differently. So I think that split, that polarization, that has been ultimately damaging to the media itself because it impacts your credibility. At the same time, there's also been, as I said before, there's been physical attacks, there's been financial instruments and legal instruments used against individual journalists as well as media organizations. In terms of financial instruments, I would say stopping circulation for newspapers, blocking channels, blocking interviews, blocking live coverage. Perhaps I'm personally in favor of a delay mechanism because I think the media has been irresponsible in the past. But at the same time, you can't shut down interviews of a political leader because it should be so obvious because everybody's watching it online. And I think that's a big difference. So with the credibility of the mainstream media, which has been impacted by deliberate campaigns, as I said, financial, legal, direct physical attacks, and the media being itself partly responsible for it through polarization, as well as the inability to report with credibility, people are turning to social media.
Yes.
And that has a whole range of problems there as well.
And it's interesting that you automatically sort of, mentioned how the lack of credibility sort of, and I think it's a vicious cycle. The lack of credibility stems from there being more control. Well, there have been attempts to exert more control on the media, and then that ends up in a lack of credibility. That leads to people going towards digital media, and then digital media is again sort of like a black hole for disinformation. So the vicious cycle sort of continues, and I completely agree with you. If you're blocking transmission of the most popular leader in the country as of right now, according to the polls, right, everybody is going to watch him online. You're essentially diverting more eyeballs to this, because even if I was not going to watch it and I get to know that you're blocking this particular interview, I'm going to go and watch it all right. Maybe there's something really important that's going to be said in this interview which you do not want people to hear. And then there's only so much control that you can exert on digital media with sort of like the... you're not a very, I would say, technology, you're not a technology-led state. You don't have technology like China or like Korea to sort of really, control.
We don't have
media.
WeChat and Weibo, and we don't.
We don't have the digital infrastructure, so to speak, right? There needs to be alternate digital.
I mean, you want to try to be China, but you're not even China ki copy.
Exactly, you're not. I absolutely agree. So and I think when you look at these sort of models that are being tactics and models of controlling media, I think those are sort of in line with how some of the powers in the world have been controlling their media, but they had resources. And then they had alternate platforms that their citizens could use, which we sadly do not have. So essentially diverting eyeballs. And this sort of brings me to like my next question to you. Moving towards digital media, because over the last years, and you mentioned this before, that we have seen an uptake of 30% every year in digital users in Pakistan, and then we're a country with a massive youth bulge. And I also want to say a massive illiterate youth bulge, actually. Our literacy rates are super low. Even the literacy rates that we see come up according to the census, we know how that census data is calculated. So we're sort of looking at this massive young population that is glued to digital media for all of the information that it gets. What's the role you think that journalism or journalists right now can play in that digital sphere? Because there's so much disinformation. You don't know which news to trust, which one not to trust. And then this is sort of going to be like the first, we could say, digital elections, so to speak, because in the last 5 years, we've really seen uptake in digital media. And then we've seen institutions as well as individuals really use digital media to sort of, incite trolls, incite mobs, incite hatred, incite intolerance. We've seen it become a tool for politics in the country like never before. So where do you think all of that is going to eventually head up? And then what's the role that journalists like yourself or media houses can actually play in sort of controlling that disinformation? Because I don't think state can control that, or state can...
The state shouldn't be. No, the state shouldn't be. Please keep the state out of it. We've had enough of the state trying to control things.
Agreed. Pardon me, the state should not be trying to control it. So what do you think should be happening?
Okay, this is a really huge, massive question, and I'm trying to find, it's difficult to find answers. And I'm going to try and sort of separate into different sort of categories. All right. So, yes, just as an aside, I've been fascinated by Pakistan's digital journey, especially through the media, and especially its use by political parties, because I remember back in the 2013 elections, I actually did a story on this, how and why PTI, for instance, at that time, because it had already set up a very sophisticated infrastructure, social media, it's the first, I think, digital political party, actually, and the reasons they had done it, and I did a story on that. And I saw that other the leaders of other political parties, individual candidates who were using social media, but obviously not systemically the way the PTI had been. So we knew that in 2013. But there's such a massive jump from 2013. Post 2013, what we'd seen was, you had 3G and then 4G, which meant reach had increased, speeds had increased. And I was doing a calculation because, I was holding a sort of election roundtables recently with a lot of stakeholders that included media, the Election Commission of Pakistan, political parties, their digital wings, election monitors. And we're trying to sort of assess the election landscape just to understand what the difference is. And yes, we concluded that this will be Pakistan's first truly digital election. If it's 2023, if the elections happen in 23, then 23. If it's 24, then 24. Whenever they happen. Whenever they happen, yes. Because since 2018, there's been an increase in social media users by about 30 to 35% every year. That's huge. And, as I pointed out, that the credibility of the mainstream media, for various reasons, has obviously been affected, which means a lot more people are turning to social media. There was a very interesting, incidentally, USIP study about misinformation and and conspiracy theories, which actually demonstrated the huge lack of trust in the mainstream media. I think that should worry the mainstream media. And by mainstream legacy media, what do we mean? We mean television. Incidentally, they also do have their own digital media, obviously platforms as well, but still, we count them as a
sort of traditional media bucket.
Traditional media, because they would have maybe FM channels, some of them, they would have a newspaper, they would have a website and an app and, television. But their sort of main platform is television. So they're mainstream. And they're partly responsible for it because they haven't seen the digital revolution coming. Right. So what's also happened, which has been interesting in the last few years, given censorship, given the shrinking of public interest journalism within the mainstream as well, it's being dominated by far by politics, less investigative journalism, but there are a lot of independent digital media outlets that have opened in the last few years. And some of them continue to do so successfully. Right. So now you have a split. You have the mainstream, which actually, so television still has a lot of millions of viewers. Yes. And polarization, it's sad to say, suits them. So I looked at some internal documents, assessments back in April 2022, which is when obviously the vote of no confidence was happening, and then sort of 3 months afterwards. And viewership for both the top two channels, which is Geo and ARY, was sky high. Yeah. But in also their ARY's social media YouTube channels actually had more eyeballs, simply because they were covering Imran Khan more.
I think it might have also been because their transmission has continuously been disrupted since April. So.
That's also true, exactly. Exactly. So that is also true, but they also, I think what it tells you really is that a political party with particular followers who are obsessive about the news, who may have turned away from the news, came back to the news because of the crises and because of the censorship and because transmission has been disrupted multiple times, ARYs in particular. They're turning to ARY's digital news platforms to watch Imran Khan. Essentially, they just want to watch Imran Khan. Not even so much, they have, PTI has its own, obviously, YouTube channel, as do some of the other political parties as well. But, clearly from election voting patterns, you can also see that Imran Khan's voting core is very much urban. It's also based out of Pakistan, the diaspora. He's very conscious of that for good reason, and as he should be, but they're the ones who are watching. So it means that people are still watching but they don't believe it. So they also turn to social media. The alternative digital news platforms are too small. When I say that those television channels still have millions of viewers, those alternative digital channels, well, some of them are doing well and surviving. They don't have the kind of audience. The ones that are trying to do public interest journalism.
Yeah.
So what's left in between is individuals.
Right.
And that is actually the serious problem here, because individual journalists who are trying to brand themselves through their YouTube channels, through particularly or now with podcasting,
Yes.
has become big. And I'm on a podcast right now.
Yeah.
But it's a good, whatever. It's another way to give information, and that's great as a replacement for radio. But these brands, these individuals who have a massive following and who tap into voters and supporters of a particular political party, they're the real problem. It isn't so much the mainstream, which has its own struggles. It isn't so much the alternative digital news platform. It's these individuals who are branding themselves. Because maybe a few of them still have those old journalistic values. They try to get information, they sort of triangulate that information through 3 sources, and they feel responsible and they correct themselves if their information is incorrect. But these most individual brand name journalists are being supported through different political parties in one way or the other, whether it's their supporters, whether it's indirectly or directly. And they know that their real value is in taking a particular line and taking a particular emotional line.
Yeah.
That is the real problem.
And all of these are business decisions as well. What makes your business flourish? I think that's an important thing to know, that all of them, none of them is sort of doing public interest journalism, as you would say. It's essentially, it comes down to a business decision, and then the business decision, you rightly said, determines where the eyeballs are sort of going to go.
And you've also seen ownership change hands. So there have been a few new channels that have opened up, and few new channels have been bought up by real estate.
Yes.
And one would wonder what the real agenda is. And there's no problem, obviously, in business owners buying new TV channels, but increasingly, because you've seen the separation of business, as you pointed out, and editorial has obviously broken down. You wonder what the agenda is and their credibility is and how they're going to make money. It's a saturated market. We don't need more news channels. We have enough of them. Advertising, it sort of dropped in 2019 when the economy was impacted. Everybody lost advertising. Thousands of journalists were laid off. You saw a lot of pay cuts as well. That sort of went up by 2020, 21. Advertising sort of got back to sort of pre-2018 levels relatively. But the spread changed. So whereas you would have 15 or 10 channels who would get now you just have the 5 main channels.
Yeah.
So how are they making money? They're making money through their business agendas, right?
Yes.
Absolutely. No, I absolutely agree. And then my question to you would also be this, that once again, we're going through an economic crisis. The economic crisis will again mean more layoffs. Less opportunities for journalists as well. But at the same time, we're going through an unprecedented political situation as well.
Which needs more information.
And
better information.
And more reporting.
Yes.
How do you see that panning out? Because we're in a transition. There's obviously less money in the market. Advertising budgets are going to probably shrink just because of the economic crisis that we're in. But at the same time, there are more eyeballs than ever before. Perhaps the ratings for the top 2 or 3 channels in the country are skyrocketing. And this I also wanted to discuss with you. And this I've seen happening in my own household as well. Entertainment is no more dramas that are on air from 8 to 12. It's actually the political shows that are happening. It's actually news is the new form of entertainment. So how do you see this sort of panning out? Because it's news versus entertainment, and in the middle of it, we have an economic crisis, which is sort of, going to end up in layoffs, at least in my field, and in a lot of fields that the rest of us are working in. But how do you see this impacting journalism?
So this is, I think, given that the mainstream media obviously has to rethink how it's doing business and how it needs to restore its credibility. And like I said, there's a lot of discussion globally around the world how to deal with the democracy crisis, with the journalism crisis, and misinformation, disinformation. But at the same time, alternative digital media platforms have an opportunity actually to reinvent the way that they do these stories. maybe because we're looking at a younger population that is not watching the mainstream, that is still wants information, that is going to be the voter. How do you reach them? So it isn't just about the platform, it's also about how you tell the story, and how you distribute that story, and how you market that story.
Absolutely.
So that's what, there's an opportunity here, and I think some of these alternative digital platforms may be doing it, as part of conversations that I've had, because, as director at the Center for Excellence in Journalism, I am, my network of journalists from when I was a journalist and now with media organizations, with the digital, is that there is a recognition that, there's obviously market forces involved as well, right? So they really do need to reinvent themselves, both mainstream and digital.
Absolutely. And then sort of going back to where we sort of started the conversation, you had mentioned, PDM versus PTI government, how there's a continued curb on, I would say, free journalism. Can you take a little step back more into history and perhaps just walk us through? I know there has historically been curbs on journalism throughout history, especially whenever there has been a military rule or when there has been political upheaval in the country, but how is this different from the past? Or is it different from the past? Or as you said, is it just deja vu with no difference at all?
Oh, okay. So if I'm going to try and do a quick summary of history, some of which I lived through and some of which I haven't lived through, which is obviously, so I started journalism in the Musharraf years, which was a military dictatorship.
Absolutely.
And at the same time, because I think Musharraf was a dictator who recognized the power of the media, his take on it was a little more liberal, which is that we open up private channels, television channels in 2002, because then you have a counterfoil to the Indian dominance of Western airwaves, for instance, because Kargil, he'd seen how Kargil had been an example of how India had dominated that narrative through its independent news channels. And, there's obviously, there was funding involved. There was a lot of, a lot of people there's a real split within the journalism community. So he was a military dictator. He opened the airwaves. Does that make him good or bad? I think it suited him. So it was a good thing. And it eventually came back to bite him, which, you could also see the recognition that perhaps the media needed to be controlled a little. And that's, obviously when he imposed emergency, and I was, witness to that. I was out protesting with the black armbands, part of the civil sort of movement as well, the lawyers' movement as it's called, but it was generally against Musharraf, which was when he imposed emergency in 2007 and he shut down all the television channels. And that's when you saw people using Facebook. This is 2020, 2008, and that's when you saw people using Facebook. There was no WhatsApp then. I still find it hard to believe there was no WhatsApp. How did we survive? But anyway, but it was Facebook. People were using Facebook to organize protests and to get information out. And I know, for instance, technology has a lot to do with how information is distributed. So there were some channels who had satellites that were outside of, their uplink was outside of Pakistan. So they had an advantage as well. That's obviously changed. So I do think that the Musharraf years were a lesson, which is that if you give the media too much rope, and I think another example of that is the Ajmal Kasab or the Mumbai attacks, where you had a lot of Pakistani channels that were openly talking about his Pakistani origins. You wouldn't see that now. You wouldn't see the kind of stories that were done then now. You wouldn't talk about Colonel Imam and how he had filed a case against the extension of, for instance, General Kayani. And that was widely discussed in the media, mainstream media. And I still remember when there was a lot of talk about Bajwa's extension and there was a court case, and this is a talk in 2019. We really didn't have that kind of open conversation. These are just some examples. Let's sort of place this in phases. Up until 1988, Pakistani media was heavily censored, was very limited, and you had multiple examples ranging from Ayub trying to control it, again through different means, which is the press, ordinances and other things. You had General Zia, actual lashings. You had open censorship that was defied by newspapers and independent media organizations. There was, for instance, there's a journalist who passed away recently, and he used to be editor of a newspaper. And the headline he sort of wrote about General Ziaul Haq going to Medina was a play on words and sort of demonstrated some kind of resistance. Yeah. So there's been resistance. There's been very heavy and open censorship because of technology. Yeah. And that kind of opened up in the Musharraf era, and then you suddenly see it closing off again, 2014, 2015, right. Especially 2016 onwards. Yes. I think I would mark 2016 as 2014 and then 2016 as another turning point. Right. In which suddenly how was media being controlled, or I would say censored, is 2016 you had the Dawn Leak story, yes. Which General Bajwa has admitted it to as being, not a big deal, obviously, just because a few junior officers had a problem with it. But it was a big deal back then, which meant that you had Dawn, Sir Al-Maida, and the newspapers using patriotism as a card. There were cases, there were investigations, people were fired in the PMLN at that time. Dawn stood its ground and paid a heavy, heavy price for it, which was its circulation being stopped in CAN stations. And so that was actually sort of an example of the financial instrument that's used.
The ones you mentioned before.
Exactly. And I can clearly see it then. Geo, the 2018 elections, Geo's networks were interrupted again. Yes. And it's been the case for various reasons. We saw during Imran Khan's time that Nawaz Sharif could not make an appearance on television. He was censored. Maryam Nawaz's interview was pulled off air. So what you see is some of these tactics. I think it is the legal and the financial, right, which has now had a really chilling effect. A lot of the lack of open reporting is partly not just because of because there's a direct notification from Temra, for instance, or a phone call, which is what happens too, which is what we experienced at 2016, 17 onwards. But also because now there's that chilling effect has taken place. The media doesn't know what the lines are, so it censors itself. Reporters censor themselves. Right. And I think there's a huge difference between people like myself, who started journalism during the Musharraf years and after 2001, and journalists who started in the media about 5-6 years ago, even 10 years ago. They're much more cautious. They don't know what those red lines are. We knew the red line was the military and it was religion. Right. And even then, because we had obviously, I would say, gone through schools of journalism that taught us how to carefully manage these red lines when we would still do the story. Right. And then the way to do the story is to do it ethically, right, which is that you are fair, you're conscious of what the laws are that can be used against you, and you go through a process of gatekeeping, so that when you put the story out there, even if it's sensitive and delicate, you're protected by the ethics of what you did. So if you were to, for instance, do a story that would take, somebody serves a defamation notice on you. In a court of law, you could say, well, we have the documents, or we have all our bases covered.
And you've sort of hinted on this, so this will sort of bring me to my last question of the podcast experience for today. We've historically seen, and as you've said, sort of the curb on journalism has been very closely tied in with the political situation of the country. And this is sort of like the first digital elections that we're looking at. The previous ones were digital, but I think this is like sort of the digital elections. And we've also seen that there's one political party, PTI, which sort of, as of right now, leads in all public opinion polls. Yes. There's massive...
And have been winning by elections.
And have been winning by elections. And so that stands to sort of, substantiate the fact that, yes, they have massive support. Mm-hmm. And considering PTI, I don't think for PTI, unlike the other political parties, voter turnout is also an issue, because they're able to connect to the youth, and that's what they're successful at, getting new voters to come in and vote for them. In this situation where essentially, we're not looking at media to sort of increase voter turnout, so to speak, rather when we are looking at the media to sort of, be that lens that sort of clears up the disinformation and lets people look at the fact, etc. But we see an environment and we see business decisions essentially that are not letting the media do this.
Yeah.
What do you think can be the role of media in the upcoming elections in this complex environment, other than sort of, just sort of doing exaggerated reporting on the political parties or on the institutions that they've sort of sided themselves with? What's the role that you think broadly media could play in this?
All right. I mean, I will say that voter turnout is something that we'll have to see, because I think there's been, because of the legal, political, constitutional, economic crisis. God, I mean, I think that the list of crises is a crisis in every sphere and dimension of public life. Yes, exactly. But my fear is that people won't turn out to vote. You say that people will be, Imran Khan can do it. It's varied a little bit. It really depends. Right. Turnout was extremely low in Karachi, for instance, and those were really important local bodies elections. So it has varied depending on the area. So my worry is that turnout will be low, which means that people have lost faith. That is always a tragedy. You have a lot of, the turnout in Indian elections is extremely high, over 60% or more. Yeah. And that's because they've had consistent elections without, political interference with institutions that are not meant, that's not their business. But yeah, the media, given that we can't even, as we were talking offline as well, that we can't even sort of decide who to believe when they say how many numbers are at a Jalsa and why that's important. So media is going through its credibility crisis.
Yes, I think.
and which is why, as much as it hurts me, and I hope that this doesn't happen, but I think that we'd have to rely on non-mainstream avenues for, credible numbers.
Right.
This is going to be an important election in terms of disinformation and misinformation, because of the fact that there are many more people who are going to be using social media and spreading that, because there's stakes are so high. And this could impact turnout. Yes. This could impact credibility of the elections, and could actually contribute the instability, is my fear.
As long as there are some efforts, there's hope of sort of going into the right direction. So I think this sort of brings us to the conclusion, and I think we can safely say that as the media sort of goes through its own, or journalism goes through its own credibility sort of crisis, alongside the myriad of crises that we have in the public life. One more crisis. But I think as long as there are independent channels and there are individuals like yourself who are there to sort of, still continue with the old school values of journalism, and at the same time be the mentors and sort of the gate openers for independent investigative journalism, I think there is no hope lost, and we'll probably continue seeing great journalists coming out of Pakistan and good journalism coming out as well.
Yeah, no, I think the great thing is Pakistan also has a history of resistance.
Yes.
From democratic organizations, people who believe in democracy, civil society, individuals, journalists.
Yeah.
So
history of resistance and resilience. Yes. So I hope we get through the Nazuk Mor. And Maha Nazuk Mor. But thank you so much, Amber, for flying down. Thank you so much for taking out the time. And we really, really appreciate all of the great insights that you've added to the conversation today. Thank you so much.